A homeless man named Jacob unexpectedly shows up at Amelia and Ryan's elegant wedding, drawing curious glances from the guests. When he steps up to the microphone, no one could have anticipated what would happen next. Amelia had once shown him kindness, but as Jacob begins to speak, the truth about their past connection unfolds in a way that leaves everyone stunned. What was it about Jacob's story that moved the entire wedding to tears? And how did this moment change both their lives in ways no one saw coming? Let's find out. But before we dive into this emotional story of compassion and redemption, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this heartwarming story, don't forget to subscribe. The sun shone brightly on a picturesque summer day, casting a warm glow over the grand Westbrook Manor. The air buzzed with excitement as guests arrived for what promised to be the wedding of the year. Luxury cars pulled up to the entrance, their occupants emerging in a dazzling array of designer suits and flowing gowns. "Oh, darling, isn't it just magnificent?" A woman in a striking red dress exclaimed to her husband as they walked up the flower-lined path. "Indeed," he replied, adjusting his bow tie. "The Johnsons certainly know how to throw a party." Inside the manor, staff bustled about, making last-minute preparations. Florists arranged stunning bouquets of white roses and lilies, while caterers wheeled in trays of champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres. Amidst the flurry of activity, Amelia stood in a private room, gazing at her reflection in a full-length mirror. Her wedding dress was a vision of elegance, its intricate lace detailing catching the light. Yet, despite the joyous occasion, a hint of sadness lingered in her eyes. "You look absolutely beautiful," her maid of honor, Sarah, said softly. Amelia smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," she replied, smoothing down the front of her dress. "I just wish—" She trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Sarah squeezed her hand reassuringly, understanding the complicated emotions her friend was experiencing. In another wing of the manor, Ryan adjusted his cufflinks, surrounded by his groomsmen. "Today's the day, boys," he announced with a confident grin. "I'm marrying the most amazing woman in the world." His best man clapped him on the back. "You're a lucky man, Ryan. Amelia's one of a kind." Ryan's smile faltered for a moment. "That she is," he agreed, his tone carrying a hint of uncertainty. Outside the manor gates, far from the glamour and excitement, stood a lone figure. Jacob, a middle-aged black man, watched the proceedings with a mixture of curiosity and longing. His face bore the marks of a hard life, and his clothes were threadbare and dirty. Yet, there was a quiet dignity about him, and his eyes held a warmth that belied his rough appearance. As guests streamed past him, many cast sideways glances, their expressions a mix of pity and discomfort. Some quickened their pace, clutching their designer bags a little tighter. "Security should really do something about that homeless man," one guest whispered to another. "He's making everyone uncomfortable." Jacob heard the whispers but remained unmoving, his gaze fixed on the manor. He couldn't explain the pull he felt, drawing him closer to the wedding despite knowing he didn't belong. A young boy, no more than 7, broke away from his parents and approached Jacob. "Are you okay, mister?" he asked, his innocent eyes full of concern. Before Jacob could respond, the boy's mother rushed over. "Tommy, get away from him," she scolded, pulling her son back. She shot Jacob an apologetic yet fearful look before hurrying away. Jacob sighed, used to such reactions. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to be here, that something important was about to happen. As the ceremony began, the sounds of a string quartet filled the air. Guests took their seats, and Ryan stood at the altar, a mix of nerves and excitement on his face. When Amelia appeared at the end of the aisle, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. She was breathtaking, her beauty amplified by an aura of kindness that seemed to radiate from within. As she walked towards Ryan, her eyes scanned the crowd, as if searching for something or someone. As the ceremony proceeded, Jacob remained rooted to his spot, an unseen observer to a world he once knew. The mystery of his presence and the hint of a connection with Amelia hung in the air, promising that this wedding day would hold more surprises than anyone could have anticipated. As Amelia stood before the mirror in her bridal suite, Her mind wandered to the path that had led her to this moment. She closed her eyes and memories of her past flooded back, painting a vivid picture of the woman she had become. 5 years earlier, on a chilly autumn morning, Amelia had walked into the Second Chance shelter for the first time. The smell of coffee and warm breakfast filled the air as she tied on a volunteer apron. "First day?" asked Maria, the shelter's coordinator, with a warm smile. Amelia nodded, her eyes wide as she took in the bustling dining area. "I've always wanted to help, but I never knew where to start." Maria patted her shoulder. "Well, you're in the right place. We can always use more helping hands and kind hearts." That day marked the beginning of Amelia's journey into a world she had only glimpsed from afar. Week after week, she returned to the shelter, learning the names and stories of those who sought refuge there. She ladled soup, distributed blankets, and most importantly, listened. One rainy afternoon, a man in a worn suit caught her attention. Unlike many of the shelter's regulars, he seemed out of place, his demeanor speaking of better days gone by. "First time here?" Amelia asked gently as she handed him a steaming cup of coffee. The man nodded, his eyes fixed on the cup. "Never thought I'd end up in a place like this," he murmured. "I'm Amelia," she said, sitting across from him. "Would you like to talk about it?" He looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Jacob," he replied after a moment. "And, yeah, I think I would." Over the next hour, Jacob shared his story. He had been a successful businessman, but a series of unfortunate events, a market crash, loss of wife, separation from his daughter, and a string of bad investments, had left him teetering on the edge of homelessness. "I'm just lost," Jacob admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Amelia reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "You're not alone, Jacob. We'll figure this out together." In the weeks that followed, Amelia became Jacob's lifeline. She helped him navigate job applications, find temporary housing, and most importantly, rediscover his self-worth. Their friendship grew, built on mutual respect and shared laughter. As Amelia's involvement at the shelter deepened, so did her passion for helping others. She organized fundraisers, coordinated job fairs, and even started a mentorship program. Her world expanded, filled with the stories and struggles of those society often overlooked. But not everyone in Amelia's life shared her enthusiasm for this work. Ryan, her boyfriend of 2 years, came from a wealthy family with traditional values. At first, he had found her volunteering charming, even joining her occasionally for holiday meal services. But as Amelia's commitment grew, tensions began to simmer. "Darling, don't you think you're spending a bit too much time at that shelter?" Ryan's mother, Evelyn, remarked one evening during a family dinner. Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp. Amelia set down her fork, feeling a familiar defensiveness rise within her. "It's important work, Evelyn. These people need help." Ryan's father, George, cleared his throat. "While that may be true, you must consider your position now, Amelia. As Ryan's fiancée, you'll have certain social obligations to fulfill. Charity work is admirable, but it shouldn't come at the expense of your duties to this family." Amelia felt Ryan tense beside her. She turned to him, hoping for support, but he avoided her gaze, suddenly very interested in his plate. "I understand your concerns," Amelia said carefully, "but this work is a part of who I am. I can balance both." Evelyn exchanged a look with George before plastering on a smile. "Of course, dear. We just want what's best for you and Ryan." The conversation moved on, but Amelia felt the weight of unspoken disapproval hanging in the air. That night, as she and Ryan drove home, the silence between them was deafening. "They mean well," Ryan finally said, his eyes fixed on the road. "They just want you to fit in with our world." Amelia turned to look at him, a mixture of hurt and disbelief on her face. "Our world? Ryan, I thought you understood how important this is to me." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I do, Amelia. I love that you care so much. But maybe it's time to scale back a bit? Focus on our future together." Amelia felt a pang in her chest. She loved Ryan, but in that moment, she realized the gulf between their worlds was wider than she had imagined. As the weeks passed and wedding preparations kicked into high gear, Amelia found herself caught between two worlds. The opulence of her soon-to-be married life contrasted sharply with the simplicity and raw humanity she encountered at the shelter. One afternoon, as Amelia pored over seating charts in the grand ballroom of Westbrook Manor, her phone buzzed with a message from Maria at the shelter. "Emergency at the shelter. Could use your help if possible." Amelia glanced at the clock, then at the mountain of wedding-related tasks before her. She bit her lip, torn between her commitment to the shelter and the expectations of her new life. "Everything all right?" Ryan asked, noticing her distraction. Amelia hesitated before responding. "There's an emergency at the shelter. They need volunteers." Ryan's face tightened. "Amelia, we have the menu tasting in an hour, and my parents are coming. You can't just leave." "People are in need, Ryan," Amelia said, her voice rising slightly. "Surely that's more important than deciding between salmon or chicken?" "It's our wedding," Ryan snapped, frustration evident in his tone. "Doesn't that matter to you?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Amelia felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Of course it matters," she said softly. "But so does this. I have to go." Before Ryan could respond, Amelia grabbed her purse and rushed out, leaving him standing alone amidst the half-finished wedding preparations. At the shelter, Amelia threw herself into the work, grateful for the distraction. A burst pipe had flooded part of the building, and volunteers were needed to move supplies and help relocate some of the residents. As she worked alongside familiar faces, Amelia felt a sense of purpose that had been missing in the whirlwind of wedding planning. Here, among those who had so little, she was reminded of what truly mattered. Hours later, exhausted but fulfilled, Amelia made her way back to Westbrook Manor. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. As she approached the entrance, she noticed a figure standing just beyond the gates. Her steps slowed as recognition dawned. It was Jacob, but not as she remembered him. Gone was the man in the worn suit, replaced by someone who looked as though he had been living on the streets for years. His clothes were tattered, his face weathered by sun and hardship. Amelia's heart clenched. What had happened to bring him to this state? She had lost touch with Jacob after he had gotten back on his feet, assuming he had moved on to better things. Seeing him now, she realized how wrong she had been. As she drew closer, their eyes met. For a moment, Amelia saw a flicker of the man she had known, proud, kind, resilient. But then his gaze dropped, and he shuffled away, melting into the gathering darkness. Amelia stood rooted to the spot, a whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. She wanted to call out to him, to understand what had gone wrong, to help. But the weight of her current reality pressed down on her. The missed menu tasting, Ryan's disappointment, her in-laws' disapproval. With a heavy heart, she turned and walked into the manor. The image of Jacob's haunted eyes burned into her memory. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Ryan paced the foyer, his face a mask of barely contained anger. His parents sat stiffly on an antique sofa, their expressions a mixture of concern and disappointment. "Nice of you to finally join us," Ryan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Amelia took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation. "I'm sorry I missed the tasting. There was a flood at the shelter, and they needed help." Evelyn stood, smoothing down her designer dress. "Amelia, dear, while your charitable work is admirable, you must understand that you have responsibilities now. You're about to become a Johnson. Certain things are expected of you." "What your mother means," George interjected, his tone patronizing, "is that it's time to leave this phase behind you. You've had your fun playing savior to the less fortunate, but now it's time to focus on your real life." Amelia felt a surge of anger. "My real life? This is my real life. Helping others isn't a phase or a game. It's who I am." Ryan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Amelia, please. We talked about this. You promised you'd cut back." She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she wondered if they truly knew each other at all. "I need some air," Amelia said quietly, turning on her heel and walking out onto the terrace. The cool night air helped clear her head, but the conflicting emotions remained. As she gazed out over the sprawling grounds, she couldn't help but think of Jacob, alone and struggling just beyond these gilded gates. The contrast was stark, a physical manifestation of the internal struggle she'd been facing. Ryan joined her on the terrace, his anger having cooled to a simmering frustration. "I don't understand you sometimes," he said, leaning against the railing. "You have everything here. Why do you insist on involving yourself in all that?" Amelia turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Because it matters, Ryan. Those people, their struggles, their triumphs, it's all real. More real than any of this." She gestured to the opulent surroundings. Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm trying to understand, Amelia." "I am. But you have to meet me halfway. This wedding, our life together, it has to come first." Amelia nodded slowly, feeling the weight of expectation pressing down on her. "I know. I'll try harder." As they stood there in silence, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing a part of herself. The image of Jacob, standing alone outside the gates, haunted her. She had helped him once, had seen him regain his footing. What had gone wrong? And more importantly, how could she reconcile the two halves of her life? The next few weeks were a whirlwind of final wedding preparations. Amelia threw herself into the tasks, partly to make up for her earlier absence, and partly to distract herself from the nagging doubts that plagued her. The grand ballroom of Westbrook Manor was transformed into a fairy tale setting. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over tables adorned with elaborate floral centerpieces. Ice sculptures glittered in the corners, and a string quartet practiced gentle melodies. As Amelia oversaw the final touches, she couldn't help but feel a sense of disconnect. The luxury surrounding her seemed excessive, almost obscene, when she thought of the struggles faced by those at the shelter. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Ryan said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Amelia leaned back into him, seeking comfort in his embrace. "It is," she agreed, trying to muster enthusiasm. "Your mother has outdone herself." Ryan chuckled. "Well, you know how she is. Only the best for a Johnson wedding." The word sent a small shiver down Amelia's spine. A Johnson wedding. Was that really who she was becoming? As the day wore on, guests began to arrive. The air filled with the chatter of the city's elite, business tycoons, politicians, celebrities. Amelia greeted them with a practiced smile, playing the role of the perfect bride-to-be. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the manor grounds, Amelia found a quiet moment alone. She slipped away from the pre-wedding festivities and made her way to a secluded spot in the garden. Sitting on a stone bench, surrounded by the heady scent of roses, Amelia closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The contrast between the life she had been living and the one she was about to step into had never felt more stark. She thought of the people she had met at the shelter, their struggles, their resilience, their humanity. She thought of Jacob and the mystery of his reappearance in her life. And she thought of Ryan, of the life he was offering her, of the love they shared. With a deep breath, Amelia stood, smoothing down her dress. The rehearsal dinner would be starting soon, and she knew she was expected to play her part. But as she walked back towards the manor, she couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring more than just a wedding. It would bring a reckoning, with herself, with her past, and with the future she was choosing. As the wedding ceremony drew to a close, Jacob stood in the shadows of a large oak tree, his eyes fixed on the joyous scene before him. The sound of applause and cheers drifted across the manicured lawn, a stark contrast to the silence that had become his constant companion. As he watched Amelia and Ryan share their first kiss as husband and wife, a flood of memories washed over him, taking him back to a time when his own life had been filled with such promise and happiness. Jacob closed his eyes, allowing himself to be transported to a different time, a different life. He saw himself standing in front of a mirror, adjusting his tie, a bright smile on his face. It was his wedding day, and Sarah, the love of his life, was waiting for him at the altar. "You ready, buddy?" his best friend Mike had asked, clapping him on the shoulder. Jacob had nodded, his heart full of hope and excitement. "More ready than I've ever been." The memory shifted, and suddenly he was in a hospital room, holding Sarah's hand as she cradled their newborn daughter, Emily. "She's perfect," Sarah had whispered, her eyes shining with tears of joy. Jacob had kissed her forehead, overwhelmed with love for his little family. "Just like her mother," he had replied. But the happy memories faded, replaced by darker ones. He saw himself sitting in a sterile doctor's office, holding Sarah's trembling hand as they received the devastating news of her cancer diagnosis. "We'll fight this," he had promised, his voice thick with emotion. Together. The following months had been a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, and mounting medical bills. Jacob had thrown himself into his work, desperate to provide for his family and cover the astronomical costs of Sarah's treatment. But as Sarah's condition worsened, so did the economy. He remembered the day he lost his job, the fear and desperation that had gripped him as he realized he could no longer afford Sarah's treatments or their mortgage. "It's okay, Jacob," Sarah had said weakly from her hospital bed. "We'll figure it out. We always do." But they hadn't figured it out. Sarah had passed away just weeks later, leaving Jacob alone with a mountain of debt and a broken heart. In his grief and desperation, he had made a series of poor financial decisions, trying to keep their home and provide for Emily. The memory of the day he lost everything was still painfully clear. Standing in front of their empty house, a foreclosure notice taped to the door, Emily's small hand in his. "Where are we going to live, Daddy?" she had asked, her voice small and scared. Jacob had swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we'll be okay. I promise." It was a promise he couldn't keep. With no job, no home, and no support system, Jacob had been forced to make the hardest decision of his life. He had called Sarah's sister, begging her to take Emily in until he could get back on his feet. "I'll come back for her," he had promised as he hugged Emily goodbye. "I love you so much, baby girl. Never forget that." But days had turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Jacob had fallen into a spiral of depression and homelessness, unable to pull himself out of the pit of despair that had become his life. It was during this darkest period that he had met Amelia at the Second Chance shelter. Her kindness and genuine concern had been a lifeline, reminding him that he was still human, still worthy of compassion. Jacob opened his eyes, coming back to the present. He watched as Amelia and Ryan made their way down the aisle, confetti raining down on them. She looked radiant, her smile lighting up her entire face. But as she passed near where Jacob stood, their eyes met for a brief moment. Jacob saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze, and his heart clenched with a mixture of hope and shame. As the newlyweds disappeared into the manor and the guests began to follow, Jacob found himself drawn forward, an inexplicable need to be closer to the one person who had shown him kindness in his darkest hour. As the evening wore on, the reception was in full swing. The dance floor was alive with movement. Laughter filled the air, and the clinking of champagne glasses punctuated the joyous atmosphere. Amelia and Ryan moved from table to table, greeting guests and basking in the glow of their newlywed status. Jacob sat quietly at his table, watching the proceedings with a mix of emotions. He felt out of place in his worn clothes, acutely aware of the sideways glances and whispered comments from some of the other guests. As the music faded and the DJ announced it was time for speeches, Jacob felt a sudden urge to speak. He needed to express his gratitude to Amelia, to let everyone know just how special she truly was. Before he could second-guess himself, he stood up and made his way towards the stage. Ryan's father, George, was just finishing his speech when he noticed Jacob approaching. His eyes widened in alarm, and he quickly signaled to the security guards stationed near the doors. "And now," George said, his voice strained, "I believe it's time for the best man's speech dash." But Jacob had already reached the stage. He gently took the microphone from George's hand, his heart pounding in his chest. A collective gasp went through the room. Guests turned to each other, murmuring in shock and disapproval. Amelia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with surprise. Jacob stood at the microphone, his hands shaking slightly as he surveyed the room. The silence was deafening, hundreds of eyes fixed on him with a mix of curiosity, disdain, and in some cases, outright hostility. He cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he began to speak. I I know I don't belong here. I'm not family, or a friend, or even an invited guest. But I couldn't let this night pass without saying something. What is he doing? Evelyn hissed, gripping Ryan's arm. You need to stop this right now. Amelia stood up quickly, her voice firm as she said, No, let him speak. The authority in her tones silenced the murmurs, and all eyes turned back to Jacob. Encouraged by Amelia's support, he continued, his voice growing stronger. My name is Jacob, and a few years ago, I was at the lowest point of my life. I had lost everything, my wife, my daughter, my job, my home. I was alone, desperate, and had given up on humanity. The room was silent now, the earlier hostility replaced by a cautious curiosity. Even those who had been most vocal in their disapproval leaned in, drawn in by the raw emotion in Jacob's voice. And then, Jacob continued, his eyes finding Amelia in the crowd. I met Amelia. She was volunteering at a shelter where I had gone for a hot meal and a place to sleep. But she gave me so much more than that. Jacob's voice cracked slightly, and he paused to compose himself. In that moment of silence, you could have heard a pin drop in the grand ballroom. Amelia didn't just see a homeless man, a problem to be solved. She saw me, Jacob, a human being who had lost his way. She listened to my story without judgment. She offered help without condescension. And most importantly, she gave me hope when I had none. Tears were now flowing freely down Jacob's cheeks, but he made no move to wipe them away. His gaze remained fixed on Amelia, who was also crying, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Amelia, you probably don't even remember all the things you did for me. The way you helped me navigate the system to get temporary housing. How you spent hours helping me update my resume and practice for job interviews. The time you stayed late at the shelter to help me write a letter to my daughter. A soft murmur went through the crowd. Many of the guests were looking at Amelia with newfound respect and admiration. But it wasn't just the practical help that made a difference, Jacob continued. It was your kindness, your unwavering belief that I could turn my life around. You made me feel human again, worthy of respect and dignity. He turned to the crowd. After Amelia helped me get back on my feet, things were good for a while, he explained, his eyes fixed on a tablecloth. I had a job, a small apartment. I was even saving up to try and get custody of my daughter, Emily, again. But then, he trailed off, his hands shaking slightly. The company I was working for went bankrupt, Jacob continued. I lost my job, and with it my apartment. I couldn't face going back to the shelter. I was too ashamed, so I just disappeared. Amelia felt her heart breaking for him. Oh, Jacob, I'm so sorry. I should have checked in on you. I should have dash. Jacob shook his head, cutting her off. No, Amelia, you did more for me than anyone else ever has. You gave me hope when I had none. I couldn't hold on to it. He turned to address the room at large now, his voice gaining strength and conviction. I stand before you today, not as the success story I hoped to be. Life is a way of knocking you down again and again. But I'm here because Amelia taught me the most valuable lesson of all, that humanity and compassion can exist even in the darkest of times. Jacob's gaze swept the room, taking in the mix of emotions on the faces before him. Some were moved to tears, others looked thoughtful, and a few still seemed skeptical. I know many of you probably think I don't belong here. And maybe you're right. But Amelia? She belongs everywhere. In mansions and in shelters, in boardrooms and on street corners. Because wherever Amelia goes, she brings light and hope and a reminder of the best parts of humanity. He turned back to Amelia, his voice softening. I don't have a wedding gift for you, Amelia. I have nothing to give except my deepest gratitude and the promise that your kindness was not wasted. You saved me in more ways than you'll ever know. And I promise you, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to pay that forward to be the kind of person you believed I could be. Jacob's voice broke on the last words, and he stood there, microphone in hand, tears streaming down his face. As the last echoes of Jacob's heartfelt speech faded away, a profound silence settled over the grand ballroom. The air, once thick with judgment and skepticism, now hummed with a new energy, one of empathy, admiration, and dawning understanding. It was as if Jacob's words had peeled away a veneer of pretense, revealing the raw, beating heart of humanity that connected everyone in the room. Amelia stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, her carefully applied makeup long forgotten. She felt Ryan's hand slip into hers, squeezing gently, grounding her in the moment. Around them, the atmosphere began to shift, like a wave rippling outward from where Jacob stood on the stage. The first sound to break the silence was a quiet sob from somewhere in the back of the room. Then another and another. Soon, sniffles and the rustle of tissues being pulled from purses filled the air. Guests who moments ago had been casting disapproving glances at Jacob were now looking at him, and at Amelia, with newfound respect and admiration. Even Ryan's parents, Evelyn and George, were not immune to the emotional impact of Jacob's words. Evelyn dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, her earlier disdain replaced by a look of shame and regret. George stood beside her, his usual confident posture softened, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. As Jacob made his way off the stage, looking both relieved and overwhelmed, Ryan gently released Amelia's hand and stepped forward. The room held its collective breath, wondering how the groom would react to this unexpected turn of events on his wedding day. Ryan approached Jacob with purposeful strides, his face a canvas of emotions, respect, empathy, and a touch of awe. When he reached Jacob, Ryan extended his hand without hesitation. "Jacob," Ryan said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed room, "thank you. Thank you for sharing your story, for your honesty, and for showing us all the true impact of compassion." Jacob looked at Ryan's outstretched hand for a moment, then grasped it firmly, a look of gratitude and relief washing over his weathered features. Ryan continued, his voice growing stronger. "I've always known that Amelia was special, but I don't think I truly understood the depth of her impact until tonight. You've opened my eyes, Jacob, and I'm grateful for that." As Ryan spoke, Amelia felt a fresh wave of tears spring to her eyes. But these were different, tears of joy, of relief, of love for the man who was not only accepting her true self but celebrating it. Ryan turned to address the room at large, his hands still clasping Jacob's. "I think we've all been reminded tonight of something important. That kindness matters, that every person has value, and that sometimes the most beautiful moments come from the most unexpected places." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Amelia saw heads nodding, saw people turning to their neighbors and engaging in quiet, earnest conversation. The earlier tension had dissipated, replaced by a sense of shared enlightenment. Ryan's parents made their way through the crowd, approaching Ryan, Jacob, and Amelia. Evelyn spoke first, her voice quavering slightly. "Amelia, dear," she began, then paused, seeming to struggle for words. We owe you an apology. We've been so focused on appearances, on what we thought was best, that we failed to see the beauty of your heart. Can you forgive us?" Amelia felt a lump form in her throat. She reached out and took Evelyn's hands in hers. "There's nothing to forgive," she said softly. "We're family, and families grow and learn together." George cleared his throat, looking uncharacteristically humble. "Jacob," he said, turning to face the man who had changed the course of the evening, "I judged you unfairly. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Your words, they've given me a lot to think about." Jacob nodded, accepting the apology with quiet dignity. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." As the Johnson family stood together, bridging the gap that had seemed so insurmountable just hours ago, Amelia felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find one of her bridesmaids, tears in her eyes and a smile on her face. "Amelia," she said, "you remember how we were all so stressed about making this wedding perfect? I think this is perfect. Not in the way we planned, but in a way that really matters." Amelia hugged her friend tightly, feeling a surge of love for everyone who had stood by her side through this journey. As they embraced, she heard snippets of conversation from around the room. "I had no idea. Makes you think, doesn't it? Maybe we could volunteer at a shelter. I've never felt so moved at a wedding." The atmosphere in the ballroom had transformed. What had begun as a celebration of wealth and status had become a celebration of humanity, of the power of kindness and second chances. Amelia saw guests approaching Jacob, shaking his hand, some even hugging him. She saw others deep in conversation, with thoughtful, engaged expressions that spoke of minds being opened and hearts being touched. Suddenly, Amelia felt overwhelmed by it all. The emotions of the day, the unexpected turn of events, the profound impact of Jacob's words. It all came crashing down on her at once. She turned, seeking out Jacob in the crowd, needing to connect with the person who had inadvertently changed the course of her wedding day and, perhaps, her life. She found him standing slightly apart from the crowd, looking a bit lost and overwhelmed himself. Without hesitation, Amelia moved towards him, enveloping him in a tight embrace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being here, for sharing your story. You've reminded me of who I am, of why I do what I do." Jacob returned the hug, his body relaxing as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "No, Amelia. Thank you. You saved me once, and tonight you saved me again. You showed me that there's still good in the world, that one person really can make a difference." As they stood there, locked in an embrace that bridged worlds and shattered preconceptions, Amelia felt Ryan's hand on her back. She turned to see him smiling at them both, his eyes shining with love and newfound understanding. "I think," Ryan said, his voice gentle, "that this is the real beginning of our life together. Not just as husband and wife, but as partners in making the world a little bit better, one act of kindness at a time." Amelia felt her heart swell with love for her new husband. Amelia noticed that a small crowd had gathered around them. But instead of the judgmental stares from earlier, she saw faces filled with warmth, curiosity, and a desire to connect. An elderly woman stepped forward, her eyes misty. "Amelia, dear," she said, "I've known your in-laws for years, attended more society weddings than I can count. But I've never seen anything like this. You've touched something real here, something important." A middle-aged man in an expensive suit nodded in agreement. "I run a large corporation," he said, "and we talk about corporate social responsibility. But this is personal social responsibility. It's made me rethink a lot of things." As more guests stepped forward, sharing their thoughts and reactions, Amelia realized that Jacob's speech and the events that followed had become the unexpected highlight of the wedding. It wasn't about the expensive decorations, the gourmet food, or the designer dresses anymore. It was about human connection, about the power of compassion to transform lives and open hearts. She saw Ryan's parents deep in conversation with some of their friends, gesturing animatedly. As she watched, Evelyn caught her eye and mouthed "thank you" across the room. Amelia smiled back, feeling a new warmth in her relationship with her in-laws. Ryan, still standing beside her, squeezed her hand. "You know," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice, "when we were planning this wedding, we talked about making it memorable. I don't think either of us could have imagined it would be memorable quite like this." Amelia laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "No, I don't think anyone could have predicted this. But honestly, I wouldn't change a thing." As the evening wore on, the reception took on a new character. Instead of the usual small talk and polite mingling, guests were engaged in deep, meaningful conversations. Amelia overheard discussions about volunteering, about using privilege to make a difference, about seeing the humanity in every person. She saw Jacob, no longer relegated to the sidelines, but surrounded by people eager to hear more of his story, to offer help, to make connections. The man who had arrived as an outsider had become, in many ways, the guest of honor. As the night drew to a close, Amelia and Ryan stood together, surveying the scene before them. The dance floor was full, but it wasn't just couples swaying to the music. She saw Jacob teaching some of the younger guests a dance he remembered from his youth. She saw Ryan's father deep in conversation with the bartender, listening intently to the young man's dreams of going back to school. "You know," Ryan said, pulling Amelia close, "I think we just witnessed something pretty extraordinary." Amelia nodded, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It's like for a few hours all the barriers came down. People saw each other as human beings, not as their jobs or their bank accounts or their social status. Ryan kissed the top of her head. And it all started with you, with your kindness to Jacob all those years ago. You amaze me, Amelia. And I promise you, our life together is going to be about more than just success and status. It's going to be about making a difference, just like you've always done. Amelia felt tears prick her eyes again. But this time they were tears of joy, of hope, of love. Together, she said, looking up at Ryan. We'll do it together. As Amelia and Ryan prepared to leave the reception, surrounded by the warmth and well wishes of their guests, Amelia approached Jacob one last time. I came here tonight thinking I had nothing to give, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But you've shown me that sometimes our stories are the most valuable thing we have to offer. Thank you, both of you, for listening, for understanding, for caring. Amelia hugged Jacob tightly, whispering, "This isn't goodbye. It's a new beginning for all of us. We're going to help you get back on your feet. For good this time." Jacob nodded, overwhelmed by the events of the day. "Thank you, Amelia, for everything. You saved me. Again." And as they walked out into the night, hand in hand, Amelia and Ryan knew that their journey together was going to be more beautiful, more meaningful, and more impactful than they could have ever imagined. Their wedding day had not just united two people in love. It had ignited a spark of change that would ripple out into the world, touching lives and opening hearts, one act of kindness at a time. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Amelia and Ryan awoke in their honeymoon suite. The events of the previous night felt almost dreamlike, a surreal blend of joy, revelation, and transformation. As they lay there, hand in hand, they knew that their wedding day had been more than just a celebration of their love. It had been the catalyst for something much greater. "I can't stop thinking about Jacob," Amelia said softly, turning to face Ryan. "I feel like we need to do something more, something concrete to help him." Ryan nodded, his eyes full of understanding and determination. "I agree. And not just Jacob. I think we have an opportunity here to make a real difference. Last night opened my eyes to so much." As they discussed their ideas over breakfast, their phones buzzed incessantly with messages and calls. It seemed that the impact of the previous night's events had extended far beyond the walls of Westbrook Manor. "You won't believe this," Ryan said, scrolling through his emails. "Remember Mr. Thompson, my father's old business partner? He's offering Jacob a job at his company. Says he was moved by Jacob's story and wants to give him a chance." Amelia's eyes widened in surprise and delight. "That's amazing. And look at this. Sarah, my maid of honor, is organizing a volunteer group to help at the Second Chance shelter. She's got half the wedding guests sign up already." As the day progressed, more and more messages poured in. Guests from the wedding were reaching out, not just with congratulations, but with ideas, offers of help, and commitments to make a difference in their communities. It was as if Jacob's speech had unlocked a wellspring of compassion and social consciousness that had been lying dormant beneath the surface of their privileged lives. Amelia and Ryan knew they had to strike while the iron was hot. They decided to postpone their honeymoon, instead throwing themselves into channeling this newfound energy into concrete action. Their first order of business was to help Jacob. With Mr. Thompson's job offer in hand, they set out to find Jacob, who had disappeared into the night after the reception. It took several days of searching, reaching out to shelters and community centers, but finally they found him in a small park, looking tired but somehow more at peace than he had been at the wedding. When they told him about the job offer, Jacob's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say," he stammered. "After everything that's happened, I never thought I'd get another chance like this." "You deserve it, Jacob," Amelia said warmly. "Your courage in sharing your story has inspired so many people. This is just the beginning." With Jacob's permission, Ryan made a call to Mr. Thompson, confirming the job offer. But they didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, Amelia and Ryan worked tirelessly to help Jacob get back on his feet. They helped him find a small apartment, got him new clothes for his job, and even started the process of reconnecting him with his daughter, Emily. As Jacob settled into his new life, the ripple effects of the wedding night continued to spread. Ryan's parents, Evelyn and George, had undergone a profound change of heart. Evelyn reached out to Amelia, asking for her help in organizing a fundraiser for the Second Chance shelter. "I've been so blind," Evelyn admitted during one of their planning sessions. "I've spent years focusing on the wrong things, on status and appearances. But seeing Jacob, it's made me realize there's so much more we could be doing with our resources and our influence." The fundraiser was a resounding success, raising more money for the shelter than Amelia had ever dreamed possible. But more than that, it brought together people from all walks of life. The wealthy elite who had attended the wedding, volunteers from the shelter, and members of the community who had been touched by the story of Jacob and Amelia's unexpected connection. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of that fateful wedding night continued to grow. Ryan, inspired by Jacob's story and Amelia's passion, started a program at his company to hire and support employees who had experienced homelessness. The program, which they named Second Chances, quickly gained attention in the business world, inspiring other companies to follow suit. Amelia, meanwhile, found herself in high demand as a speaker and consultant. She traveled to other cities, sharing her experiences and helping communities set up their own programs to support those in need. Her work was challenging and often exhausting, but every time she saw a life changed, a family reunited, or a community come together, she knew it was all worth it. One crisp autumn day, almost a year after their wedding, Amelia and Ryan stood hand in hand outside the Second Chance shelter. The building looked different now, freshly painted, with new windows and a welcoming entrance. But the biggest changes were inside. As they walked through the doors, they were greeted by the sound of laughter and the smell of fresh coffee. The main room, once sparse and utilitarian, was now filled with comfortable furniture, computers for job searches and education, and a play area for children. On one wall hung a large photograph from their wedding night. Jacob at the microphone, his face alight with emotion as he told his story. Maria, the shelter's coordinator, rushed over to greet them. "Amelia, Ryan, you're just in time. We're about to start the graduation ceremony." Amelia felt a lump form in her throat as she looked around the room. Gathered, there were dozens of people, all participants in the shelter's new comprehensive support program. Some were dressed in suits and dresses, ready to start new jobs. Others wore casual clothes but stood tall, proud of the progress they had made in rebuilding their lives. As the ceremony began, Amelia and Ryan took their seats in the back, content to watch as Maria called each graduate forward. Each person had a unique story, a journey from despair to hope, from isolation to community. And as each name was called, Amelia felt her heart swell with pride and gratitude. Halfway through the ceremony, Maria paused, a mischievous glint in her eye. "We have a special guest who would like to say a few words," she announced. "Someone who has been an inspiration to us all." Amelia gasped as Jacob walked onto the small stage. He looked nothing like the man who had crashed their wedding a year ago. Dressed in a crisp suit, his face clean-shaven and his eyes clear, he radiated confidence and purpose. "Good afternoon, everyone," Jacob began, his voice steady and warm. "A year ago, I stood in front of a very different crowd and told my story. I was broken then, lost and alone, but that night changed everything, not just for me, but for so many of us." He paused, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Amelia and Ryan. "Thanks to the kindness of two remarkable people and the generosity of a community that opened its heart, I stand before you today not just as a success story, but as living proof that second chances are real." Jacob went on to share how he had reconnected with his daughter, Emily, how he had excelled at his new job, and how he now volunteered at the shelter, mentoring others who were where he had once been. "But my story is just one of many," he continued. "Look around this room. Every person here has fought battles, faced demons, and come out stronger. Every graduate today is a testament to the power of compassion, of community, and of never giving up on ourselves or each other." As Jacob concluded his speech, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Amelia felt Ryan's arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. She looked up at him, seeing her own emotions reflected in his eyes, pride, love, and a deep sense of purpose. After the ceremony, as they mingled with the graduates and their families, Amelia found herself in a quiet corner with Jacob and Maria. "I never thought I'd see the shelter like this," Maria said, her voice filled with wonder. "When you first started volunteering here, Amelia, I knew you were special, but I never could have imagined all of this." Jacob nodded in agreement. "You two have changed so many lives, not just the people here, but in the wider community too. It's like you've started a movement." Amelia felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "We may have been the catalyst," she said softly, "but this is about so much more than us. It's about what happens when people come together, when we see the humanity in each other." As they talked, Ryan joined them, wrapping an arm around Amelia's waist. "I have some news," he said, his voice excited. "Remember how we've been trying to expand the Second Chances program? Well, I just got a call from the mayor's office. They want to partner with us to implement it citywide." The news was met with gasps of excitement and joy. As they discussed the implications and possibilities, Amelia felt a sense of awe wash over her. From a chance encounter at a shelter, to an unexpected wedding speech, to a citywide initiative, the ripple effects seemed endless. Later that evening, as Amelia and Ryan walked home hand in hand, they found themselves reflecting on the incredible journey of the past year. "You know," Ryan said thoughtfully, "when we got married, I thought I knew what our life together would be like. I had this image of corporate success, social status, all the trappings of the life I'd grown up with. But this is so much more than I ever could have imagined." Amelia squeezed his hand, her heart full of love and gratitude. "It's funny how life works out, isn't it?" That night, when Jacob took the microphone, I was terrified. I thought everything was falling apart. But really, everything was falling into place. As they reached their apartment building, they paused, looking up at the starry sky. "So," Ryan said with a smile, "are you ready for our next adventure?" Amelia's hand unconsciously moved to her stomach, where the first signs of a baby bump were just beginning to show. They had found out about the pregnancy a few weeks ago, and the news had filled them both with joy and a renewed sense of purpose. "More than ready," Amelia replied, her voice filled with warmth and excitement. "Our child is going to grow up in a world where kindness matters, where second chances are real, and where every person is seen for who they truly are." Ryan pulled her close, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. "And they'll know that it all started with their mother's compassion and a wedding that changed everything." As they made their way up to their apartment, Amelia felt a profound sense of peace and purpose. The journey hadn't always been easy. There had been challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But as she looked back on the past year, she knew that every struggle had been worth it. Their wedding day, which had begun as a celebration of their love, had become so much more. It had been the beginning of a movement, a ripple effect of compassion and change that continued to spread, touching lives and transforming communities. And as Amelia drifted off to sleep that night, her hand intertwined with Ryan's, she knew that this was just the beginning. Their love story had become a story of hope, of second chances, and of the incredible power of human kindness. And with each new day, with each life touched and changed, that story would continue to unfold, creating a legacy of compassion that would endure for generations to come. In the years that followed, Amelia and Ryan's commitment to making a difference only grew stronger. Their daughter, Hope, was born into a world that was slowly but surely changing for the better. As she grew, she witnessed firsthand the power of compassion and the importance of seeing the humanity in every person. The Second Chances program expanded beyond their city, becoming a model for communities across the country. Jacob, once a symbol of despair, became a respected speaker and advocate, sharing his story and inspiring others to both seek and offer second chances. Amelia and Ryan's wedding anniversary became an annual event, not just a celebration of their love, but a gathering of a community dedicated to making a difference. Each year, they renewed not only their vows to each other, but their commitment to creating a more compassionate world. And so, what had begun as an unexpected moment at a high society wedding had grown into a movement, a ripple effect of kindness and change that continued to spread, touching countless lives and reminding everyone of the transformative power of compassion, understanding, and second chances. As Amelia often said, when asked about the incredible journey that had started on her wedding day, love isn't just about two people coming together. It's about opening our hearts to the world, about seeing the best in each other and in ourselves. And when we do that, when we truly see each other, that's when miracles happen. And in the lives changed, the communities transformed, and the hope restored, those miracles continued to unfold, day after day, year after year, a lasting legacy of a wedding that had become so much more than anyone could have ever imagined. What would you do if you were in Amelia's shoes, discovering the heartbreaking reason why a homeless man like Jacob showed up at her wedding? Would you have welcomed him with open arms or taken a different approach? If this emotional story of compassion, second chances, and the unexpected bond between two strangers touched you, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put so much care into sharing these powerful stories, and your support truly helps me continue creating them. Thank you for being part of this journey.